Good morning. It's Thursday, the 19th of October 2023. We've had hurricane or storm, Babbitt, or whatever you call it, and there's been a lot of rain. There's been flooding down the south of Ireland. This is internal combustion. I'm dealing with no politics, no giving out, nothing here. This is purely for vintage, for to explain a few different concepts that you might not be totally familiar with. Now, the internal combustion engine came after the steam engine. In the steam engine, the combustion took place in a firebox, in a boiler, so it was external combustion. You couldn't burn coal in an engine, in the cylinder of an engine. Well, then, as oil became available, a liquid fuel, the concept of the internal combustion engine came into being. Now, I'm not going to explain it. There's umpteen really good videos on the various video platforms on the two types, the two-stroke and the four-stroke. And we're going to take a look at them. And I eventually hope that this will then lead on to explaining some of the more unusual concepts, which are the glow plug engine and the hot bulb engine that you see at vintage. So I'll be explaining, vintage displays. I'll be explaining the hot bulb engine, but I'll have a separate video for it, so you don't have to keep watching here. And I emphasize, if you're not into this, please switch off. I do not want you wasting time on my channel if it's not something you're interested in. Now, the thing is that the concept of an internal combustion engine comes from really the gun. With cannon guns, shotguns and rifles, you had a barrel. With the present engine, you have a cylinder. It's the same thing. And the barrel is closed on one end, and there's a piston that fills the cylinder, and it's connected to a crankshaft. Now, there are two basic types. There's the four-stroke, which has a camshaft which runs at half the speed of the crankshaft, and it operates two valves. And one is the inlet as the piston's going down, one is the exhaust as the piston is going up after firing, and then there's the compression and the ignition. So it's compression, ignition, exhaust and induction. Now, the funny thing is, the first problem you would have inventing this engine is, how do you get the air in to be burned? And you draw it in by pulling the piston down. Okay, but funny enough, then the piston has to come up to be fired. But as the piston comes up to be fired, it compresses the air, which is 1/5 oxygen and 4/5 nitrogen. And as it compresses the air, it makes it more likely to fire. And it makes it hotter, because as you compress both oxygen and nitrogen, suddenly you warm it. You may have often pumped up a bike and it'll get warm. On the other hand, if you have a cylinder of gas and it's used a lot, it'll get cold. You'll see ice forming on the part of the liquid, where the liquid is in the cylinder. So that principle, not only do you get the air in conveniently, but you compress it, which is real convenient too. And when you get it up to the top dead center, the ideal thing is to get ignition. Now, ignition is in a diesel engine or a petrol engine caused by a spark or an injector, which the injector sends in an atomized fuel, but it doesn't have to be caused by either of those two. If you can get the conditions with the heat of the sudden compression and the fuel incorporated in it, you can mix it as a carburetor as such. You can compress it, and if you can get it to fire close to the top, it will run your engine, because if the piston fires a little early, the flywheel will take it round a bit, and if it fires a bit late, it's retarded, it doesn't matter. So you don't have to have optimum efficiency. So you can also fire it by various other means, including the hot bulb. So there's two types. One is you draw in a mixture of the fuel, petrol and air. and you compress it and you fire it. The other one is you draw in the air only, and when it gets to the top dead center, you add the fuel. Get the point? It's not the case that you cannot fire it without an injector or a spark. Okay. Now, the two concepts of how you do this is the two-stroke and four-stroke. So I've explained the four-stroke, they're there online, and most car engines are four-stroke, and most lorry engines. It's very, very convenient power pack, and any reduction in efficiency by having to go twice for a power stroke. In other words, having the crank having to revolve twice for one power stroke, as opposed to the two-stroke where the crank revolves once, can be made up by adding extra cylinders. So in the case of a big articulated lorry with a big load, you can make up for that because you need a lot of torque. The four-stroke is good for torque because you don't let out the hot gases till the piston is near the bottom, and you can add more and more cylinders as you like. And there used to be V8s and all that, all very good, but actually it has turned out that just a single row of cylinders is as efficient as any. Now, in the case of the two-stroke, you can use the sump. As you pull down the piston, you compress the mixture or the air in the sump, and then you have a bypass that shoots it round and into the cylinder, and then compresses it and fires it. There's a port to let out the exhaust, which is a little above the port for the inlet. Okay, that's the simple two-stroke, like a chainsaw, which has a mixture of petrol and oil, and because there's no lubricant available in the sump, you have to add a little lubricant to the fuel. That's not that clean or efficient either. But then you can have a two-stroke similar to the Land's tractor, for example, which draws the air into the sump, compresses it when the piston comes down, pushes it up into the cylinder and compresses it and fires it. In those, it was possible to have an oil pump for lubricating oil, and to have the crankshaft going round so that the air didn't mix with the lubricating oil. It wasn't always efficient. The Lands had a habit of burning the oil in the sump, and if the oil ran out, you would have a problem because you'd have no lubrication. Okay, now the other type, the Lands was a two-stroke, by the way. In the other type, another type of engine is the one used in shipping, and it's a big, long engine. It could be 60 meters in length, and it has separate cylinders attached by means of bolts so that they're not necessarily part of the block below. These are all two-stroke. They use a compressed air to put in the air. So instead of the piston compressing the air in the sump, you have the normal oil in the sump, normal lubrication. There's a separate compressor, and when the piston comes down, the first thing is the exhaust gases get out, and then over here you have high pressure air pushing in. So it's pushing in, and it doesn't matter if a bit of it's lost. If it pushes out the gas out the other port for briefly, it doesn't matter. So that tends to let the exhaust gases go out on the first port. Then the piston comes down further, and then there may be a little bit of a bump on the piston to divert it up. Then the high pressure air forces the air into the cylinder, forces out any residual exhaust that's in it, and then when the piston comes up, it is a lovely fresh amount of air compressed, ready to fire with an injector. Because they're very big engines, they don't run that fast, even though they're two-stroke. If they were four-stroke, they'd run even slower. But there's really no need for four-stroke in shipping. You have no shortage of space. You have a huge vessel. You have no shortage of space. Also, the propeller of a ship doesn't have to revolve very fast. You don't need a gearbox. You can drive the propeller by the engine. Now, there may be a clutch business or a fluid type of clutch, and that's all right, and there's a reverse and all of that. So now that's the type that's used in shipping. That type of an engine wouldn't do in a tractor. It's too bulky. and having the compressors too bulky, so you need to use whatever you have available. Okay, so now you have the basics. Now I had a Petter's 4-stroke diesel engine for a cement mixer, and I still have it, and some of the parts got lost. I must try and get them, but I had that, and it was a noisy hard engine, and it was started by a handle, geared up handle, and there was a decompressor, and really on a winter's day, even though it was in good condition, I got it done up, you would have to, it'd be better always heat the engine a wee bit with a blow lamp to get it going. It save a lot of hassle and get it started. Okay, now one of the things I noticed about the Petter's engine, I did an experiment with it one time. So the Petter's engine was a single cylinder engine, air cooled, and I used to get a syringe. This is a cattle syringe, but I used to get a syringe, and you could turn off it stopped by, when you pull the stopper, you cut off the fuel. And I used to get the syringe and pull in a mixture of various fuels. And when it'd be running good, I would turn off the fuel and start squirting in this into the intake. And sometimes I clinch the end needle to give it a bit of a spray effect, give it a bit of an atomizer type effect, but only semi-effective. As long as I kept this going in, a small amount of this, the engine would run. It mightn't run as efficiently as it would with the injector, but it would run. Now, it wouldn't run on pure petrol, but it would run on a mixture of petrol and paraffin, but it'd run best on diesel. Okay, and if you put a bit of lubricating oil into it, like waste engine oil, it would run on that. But I don't think I ever tried it with pure engine oil, but it would certainly run on a mix. Now, what was happening there was that as the piston came down and fired and exhausted, and I turned off the fuel, the injector, as the piston when the piston came down, it sucked in a mixture of air and diesel or some other fuel. And as it did, it compressed it. And if you got this right and just give it the right amount, it wouldn't fire until it was near top dead center. And if you can see here, you see the thing in the top dead center is when the piston's up at the top. If it fired somewhere in this range, you know, the piston would be going like this. If it fired somewhere from here up, there was enough power in the flywheel to bring it right around and keep it running. And by adjusting the amount you put in here, you could get it to run fairly good. Now, I don't think it'd start, but certainly you could keep it going if you were to supply a diesel. It'd go forever. And that's very important to understand. There is the heat that was in the engine. It wouldn't work too well if it was very cold, but I honestly didn't try it too much. But the heat that was in the cylinder, in the piston, and in the area into the intake, and the heat collected by the gas, the air, as it was forced up, and the fuel in there, eventually fired it. And I think the problem with petrol was if you put in the petrol, it'd fire it too early, and instead of the piston going up like this, it'd fire it here. It would fire it on the way up, and it wouldn't be able to go right up and cycle. It would fire like that, and that would kind of push it down. So there mustn't be enough power in the internal combustion oil engine to burst anything. I've never heard of a cylinder bursting. It's just the right power without being too powerful. But in any event, you understand now. So when I injected fuel into the intake of the diesel engine, as long as I kept pushing the finger, it would run fairly good. That's a fact. Now, to finish off on this, there's another concept we need to know. Years ago, when I was a young lad, I used to go to my uncle's, who was a farm, and he had a Ferguson 20 TVO. Now, the TVO, I have one of them yet, the TVO started on petrol, and then you change it over to TVO, tractor vaporizing oil, which was a sort of refined paraffin and is used in aircraft. If you added a little petrol to paraffin, it would more or less do the same, but not as good. The tractor vaporizing oil was the business for those engines. There was a beautiful smell of them, and the compression ratio had to be less. If you're trying to run a modern petrol engine on TVO, or even a Lister engine, or some of them you see at antique shows, you'd need to put an extra gasket under the head to give it a bit less compression. So there was a compromise. It started on petrol, and so did the old Fordson, but there was a wee bit less compression ratio. Okay, and I don't actually know why that was, but I suspect the problem was if you had too high a compression, she'd fire without a spark at all, and you'd have the crankshaft were kicking, and maybe I knew a man who had his leg broken by the starting handle of a Fordson, the old Fordson, right? TVO. Now, the thing about it is that my uncle was up at a farm, and I was back at his house in with my aunt, and I heard him coming, and I was outside, and he pulled up on the road, and he started to shout, "It won't stop! It won't stop!" I'd say I was about 12. And what was happening was he let it run low in water, and the cylinder head got hot. And as the cylinder head got hot, it actually fired the mixture of TVO and air. Turning off the ignition had no effect, nothing. And so it was firing by the heat of the head of the cylinder. And there it was. Now, it probably wasn't going as well as if it was running with the spark plugs. But funny enough, at the age of about 12, he says to me, "It won't stop." And I must have been fairly wise at that time. Now, I'm not sure was I told about this or what. I think my father had mentioned it. He says that's pre-ignition. That's ignition before it's meant to happen. But it's different to advancing the timing on one of those old Model T cars. What was happening was the TVO and air was brought in, it was compressed, and as it came up and as it was compressed, the mixture was fired by the heat of the cylinder head, which might have been even slightly red or maybe hot anyway. It was fired and it kept running. And that is very important to understand how some engines work. The other engine, now what, oh yes, I meant to tell you, he says it won't stop. And I says to him, put it into fourth gear, the top gear, put the brake on and let out the clutch slowly. And he put it into top gear, he put the brake on and he let out the clutch slowly, and it stopped. It wasn't as powerful as the proper engine, and when the brake was on and it was in a high gear, it stopped it. If you had to put in a low gear, it mightn't stop it as easily. And I was wise enough to know that, but I can't say at the time whether my father had already taught me that or not. I don't know. We got it stopped anyway. It's a matter of letting it cool and putting in a drop of boiling water to start off and get the water back in, and away she went. But it could have burnt the gasket if it went on long enough. And this was a problem where you let it run out of water because you couldn't stop it. And if it was a stationary engine, you mightn't. The only thing was cut the fuel by whatever means you could. Now, there's another type of engine used in model aircraft called a glow plug engine, where you start them with a special mixture and you have to put a battery to the plug and it heats it up to a high point, and when it starts it'll keep running, because the firing mixture will keep the glow plug glowing. It'll keep it hot. There's another type of engine used in model aircraft, and you'll know them because they have a screw on the top to adjust the compression, and it runs on another fuel. It's not diesel, but it's compression ignition, and it's like a diesel, and it doesn't need an injector either. It'll run without any timing. The timing is that the fuel is gauged, the compression ratio is gauged, the space in the cylinder is gauged to get it to run without any injector or any spark plug whatsoever. Widely used in very small engines, but the principle will apply in nearly all engines. And in the next video, and if you want to go in there on YouTube, there's no point in me doing a drawing of a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke. In the next video, we're going to look at something I think will be very popular, and that's I'm going to explain how the hot bulb engine works. How the hot bulb engine works. So folks, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you back for the next one on the hot bulb engine.